That's the right direction. Okay. So for some background, this is what we now call the ammonium paradox. And the conventional wisdom is that excess nutrient loads cause phytoplankton blooms and result in cultural eutrophication and all the bad things that happen with that, low oxygen and harmful algal blooms and so on. But the empirical evidence from work both in our laboratory in this Bay Area and also in other systems in Europe and in Canada show that excess ammonium may actually result in reduced primary productivity, and we call that then cultural oligotrophication, that is decreased algal biomass and altered phytoplankton community. Another piece of background is that there's a link between phytoplankton productivity and fish yield, and this is a diagram that you've probably seen before from constructed by Scott Nixon and added to by a lot of other people. The point is that you get a relationship between primary productivity, that's of algal productivity, and the yield of fish along the x-axis, and this line is the connects those two things. And this points in this circle up here are from the highly productive parts of the world ocean and highly productive estuaries. These small circles, red circles, are San Francisco estuary, and these are at different times. I've lost there we are. These are at different times, and this is pre-clam period, early times. And it was already a very unproductive estuary, and the thing is that it has become less and less productive with time. And so now the circle is way down and very low, and there's very little chance, there's very little possibility for yield of fish under these circumstances. This is also familiar probably to most of you. This is a plot of chlorophyll concentrations. And I'm losing, there we are. With time, over the years, starting back in the 70s and on up through to the 2000s. And you can see a kind of decline in the peaks occurring here. And then there's a sudden collapse in 1987, which has been attributed to the clams, but in fact clams cannot explain all of this because they're not very much around in the springtime, so it's not really a factor in spring. There was another thing that was happening at that time, and that was this is a plot, Alan Jasby, showing the increase in ammonium loading as a function of time. Along the lower axis you see 1985 up to 2005, and the green plots is the ammonium discharge into the Sacramento River. The red dots are the population of the greater Sacramento area, and that gives you a pretty well-known relationship between discharge. It's about 100,000 population, gives you 1 ton of nitrogen discharged every day. So that was another thing that was happening, and maybe one other factor, at least in the spring bloom situation. And then another piece of background, you've all seen this, I'm pretty sure, is from a paper by Pat Glibbert, and relating the changes that occurred over the same length of time as I showed you just before, but as a function of increasing ammonium concentration along here. It doesn't seem to work all that well, but originally we had diatoms as the major food supply. This is a diatom era. That was a period of high nitrate, relatively high nitrate concentrations in the river and low ammonium. And then we move over to the point where ammonium increased substantially, diatoms disappeared, phytoplankton now are small, and the zooplankton are small. And then we move on to the next one where we have high ammonium, but the phosphate has been reduced, and we're going into a period which he calls the cyanobacteria era, which will probably have some, well, right now we do have microcystis developing in the area. Well, there's a physiological background to this, and that is that ammonium at relatively low concentrations inhibits the uptake of nitrate. And this is from work that we did under an EPA grant in 2000 and to 2002, and for 3 areas, Suisun, San Pablo, and Central Bay. And those are color-coded, but it doesn't really matter. If you look down here at about 4 micromoles, there we are. So we have, at this point, above 4 micromoles, which is 0.056 milligrams per liter, it virtually, ammonium will inhibit nitrate uptake almost entirely. So we need less than 4 micromoles in order to get the uptake of nitrate. And the reason that that's important, well, one more indication of the effect of ammonium. This is a log plot made by Jim Klern originally, and it's based on the large data set that USGS has done for about 30 years now, I think, throughout the area. And the lower axis is ammonium, log plot of ammonium. Here we are, which is about 4 here, and then there's this nitrate on this axis. The bubbles are proportional to the concentration of chlorophyll. And so the big bubbles all occur to the left of this line, about 4 micromoles. Again, seems to be a kind of natural boundary. And then you see that these small ones over here are actually purple only because the bubbles are so small that you're just seeing the boundaries for the bubbles. So chlorophyll then is associated with low ammonium and high nitrate. So the reason this matters is that for example, let's say Suisun Bay, that ammonium is the small proportion and nitrate is the big proportion of dissolved inorganic nutrient. And if you look up here, we have a relationship which is pretty stable. If you convert 1 micromole of nitrogen per liter into biomass of phytoplankton, you'll get 1 microgram of chlorophyll A per liter. So if this proportion, let's say if all of this ammonium and all of this nitrate were converted into chlorophyll, you would get about 40 micrograms of chlorophyll. That would be a pretty good bloom. But because the major part of this dissolved inorganic nitrogen is as nitrate, and because ammonium is present at 4 micromoles, then only the ammonium is going to be used. And so the largest pool of nitrogen is unavailable, and it basically just goes out through the Golden Gate. It's unavailable for primary productivity. So that it really matters what the concentrations of ammonium are. In 2010, we made a study, a detailed study with Region 2 support of the Suisun Bay. You can see up here all of these, every red dot is a station. We did those every week for the spring period. And over on the right then we have contour plots of chlorophyll on the top and ammonium concentration below. And now I'm going to turn the map vertically that way so that you can relate to these. Each of the red dots here are one of the stations over here. So this is going from west to east. In order to analyze this, you need to think of going in the horizontal direction as if you want to know what's happening in time. If you want to know what's happening in space, then you go in this way. This is chlorophyll in the gray area. This is chlorophyll above 10 micrograms per liter, which is a bloom. We observed 2 of these in the spring of 2010. These are rare now. They happen maybe once in every 10 years now. And below then, the gray area is ammonium concentrations less than 4 micromoles, which is kind of our boundary number. And you can see that these are really pretty well correlated. This black line here is the 2 salinity line, and these blooms occurred on the north side, or on the, on the east side, and the freshwater side of this, of that boundary. And we just compare 2010, when there was a bloom in 2009, to try and understand what might have happened to give us this rare bloom. On the left here, we see that in 2010, there was an increase in flow up to about 800 cubic meters per second. And that did not happen at that time in 2009. Another thing that happened in 2010 was that the discharge into the river went down by about 1 ton of nitrogen per day. So from this, and then what happened? It's pretty universally believed that the area is food, that the upper ecosystem is food limited. So what happened in 2010 then was that the phytoplankton increased by a factor of 10. The zooplankton, and these were the bigger ones, increased almost the same amount, but a 10-fold increase. Delta smelt increased 70%, and the longfin smelt increased almost 200% in the fall, midwinter, water trawl. I keep saying midwinter trawl, but that's wrong. Okay. So there seemed to be an ecosystem response quite quickly. So we built a little box model to try and come up with a criteria to understand what brings these blooms to happen. First thing to remember is that this area is not like a culture flasks where everything stays steady and the nutrients can all be taken up. It's actually more like this beaker in which you could see a stirring rod here, and inside, you can't really see it very well here, but there's phytoplankton. Here is an input of nutrients and then an output of nutrients over on the other side, and then what happens inside there determines whether you're going to have, let's see, okay, now let's see. Okay, so then we set up a series of 3 criteria for a bloom. The first one is that the loading of nitrogen must not exceed the capacity of phytoplankton to assimilate the ammonium, or the ammonium concentrations inside this reactor or bay are just going to increase. And then we have a concentration criterion that says that the ammonium must eventually become lower or fall to lower than 4 micromoles per liter in order to enable phytoplankton to take up the nitrate that's in that batch of water. And then finally, a dilution criteria, which is that the river flow must not exceed the phytoplankton growth rate in order to avoid washout. If they can't grow as fast as they're being washed out, you wind up with just a clear beaker or a clear bay of water. And so we have some estimates then of what these 3 criteria are numerically from some calculations. I won't go up to the first one, is difficult to follow and don't have time, but the concentration criteria requires a river flow of more than 825 cubic meters per second, which is 29,000 CFS, and that's in order to get the ammonium concentrations down to low enough value. The washout criteria requires a river flow of less than 1,100, which is 39,000 CFS, or you'll get washout. So the difference between these two, 29,000 and 39,000, is the window within which you could get a bloom forming. So based on these three criteria, what management action would have some effect? And basically the most effective one would be to reduce the ammonium discharge, and the reason for that is because that immediately addresses two of the three criteria, which is the loading criteria, and also the it increases it takes care of the concentration criterion also. Important thing to realize is that increasing flow alone will improve the concentration criterion, but it doesn't influence the loading. Loading is independent of flow, and if you increase the flow to get the concentration criteria right, you probably quickly exceed the washout criterion. And I believe that's the end.
Thank you, Dr. Dugdale. I think in the interest of time, I'm going to skip my conclusions, which are pretty much what you've already heard, but I'd be happy to give them if you would like to hear them. Otherwise, we could go to some questions.
I think they're hungry, Dave.
I'm hungry. Absolutely, I'm hungry. I can address some of the other questions that were raised at the beginning if you'd like. One was on turbidity. I'll give you the answer as I know it. I wouldn't say that I'm the expert on this. Turbidity I would say in the winter and spring in the estuary, particularly in Suisun Bay, in my view is dominated by suspended sediment loading that's coming in from upstream. And that's been measured for a long time by USGS, and the numbers are clearly dropping. There's less and less suspended sediment coming down in the rivers for the same amount of flow. Very clear in the data. And that then has repercussions for what's happening farther downstream. If you have less, basically, mud coming down the river, it ultimately gets reflected in the winter and spring in less turbidity. And it appears also to have the secondary effect of causing the depths to increase, because if you don't, basically the system comes out of balance. If you don't have enough sediment coming down the river, the tides are eating away at the bottom of the water column. And this is, I think, is one reason the channels have gotten so much deeper in the last 20 years. In fact, there's a paper by Dr. Scholhammer that talks about this, and he actually suggested that in around 2000, I think maybe we reached a point where you stopped eating the bottom so much, and so you no longer had that kind of reserve of sediment to draw on and suspend and maintain turbidity levels, and that's actually one reason why we saw a big drop in turbidity around 2000 in the system. Our paper addresses the summer and fall issue as well. I think that some of the turbidity during that period historically was probably chlorophyll and phytoplankton derived. There's very tight correlations between summer and fall turbidity and chlorophyll levels, diatom levels, and so on. So with increasing nutrients, with Potamacorbula, I think that is part of the reason that we're seeing a lot clearer water. So those, and then there's the SAV and all this other stuff. But there's some big global things like that going on. I don't know that individual discharges are really having a big effect. Then there was the question about summer flows that was asked. I don't feel really qualified to answer that. I would like to refer that back. Unless Chuck wants to take that one on, I would like to reserve that one and have probably Paul Hutton address that either in person or in writing. But it's a legitimate question, and I would like to get you a response, but by someone who's more competent to answer.
Very good. Thank you very much. We will resume at 1:30. Can we handle that all right, Brock?
Yes, we can. We only have one panel this afternoon, and I don't anticipate they'll take their full time.
Okay. Very good.
Can I just ask that the expert panel, when, is it off?
The expert panel could,
Yeah, can the expert panel think about responding to the issue of correlations and how many ways you can do that when they come back at the end of the day? What's jumped out at them from all these conversations?